The wind scythed down from the mountains, sharp with the bite of early winter. It rattled the brittle branches overhead and carried the faint, acrid smell of smoke from some far-off camp. Abigail Turner tugged her shawl tighter across her shoulders, though the wool did little against the chill that had sunk into her bones. She had gone farther than she meant to, searching for dry kindling along the tree line before night dropped its heavy curtain. Her mare had carried her steady and slow across the frost-touched earth, but now the animal stamped and tossed its head, ears flicking back with unease. Abigail paused, breath rising pale in the fading light. She was no stranger to unease. At 45 years of age, with salt and pepper hair escaping her braid and a body bent by years of labor, she had known hunger, loss, and solitude. But something about the silence tonight pressed heavier than usual, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. She reached for another branch, snapped it clean, and stuffed it into the sack on her arm. That was when she heard it, the low rumble of men's voices, carried thin by the wind. The mare snorted and jerked against the reins. Abigail's heart stuttered. She turned, eyes straining in the dimming dusk. Figures emerged from between the pines, shadows first, then shapes. 3 men, their coats flapping, spurs jangling, rifles slung careless across their saddles. Rustlers. She knew the type by the easy cruelty etched into their faces, the smirks that widened when they spotted a lone woman. "Well, look here," one of them drawled, his teeth flashing in a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "A lady gatherin', sticks in the cold. Ain't safe to wander so far from town." Abigail's throat dried. She clutched the reins, willing her horse not to bolt. "I've no quarrel with you," she managed, though her voice trembled. Another man leaned forward in his saddle, eyes narrowing as they flicked over her. "Quarrel? Don't reckon you got much of anything. Except maybe something worth talking." They laughed, harsh in the frozen air. Abigail took a step back, pulse hammering. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move fast enough, and she knew they'd catch her easy on horseback. Her mare squealed, yanked free, and thundered off into the dark, leaving her standing bare and exposed with only a sack of sticks and fear twisting in her gut. One of the rustlers dismounted, boots crunching the frost. He swaggered forward, hand brushing the hilt of his knife. Abigail's breath came shallow. She lifted her chin, refusing to crumple, though her knees quaked beneath her skirt. "Stay back," she whispered. The man chuckled. "Or what?" Before she could answer, the stillness cracked. A single rifle shot split the air, sharp as lightning. Bark exploded from a tree inches from the rustler's head. He froze, curse dying in his throat. The other men whipped their heads toward the sound. Out of the trees rode a figure on a dark bay horse, tall and steady, rifle raised with calm precision. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His presence cut through the scene like a blade. The wind tugged at his hat brim, revealing steady gray eyes beneath, eyes that weighed and measured with unshakable resolve. Abigail exhaled a shudder she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Relief tangled with disbelief. She didn't know this man, yet something in his bearing told her she was no longer alone. "Best ride on," the stranger said at last, his voice quiet but carrying, iron wrapped in velvet. The rustlers shifted uneasily. "You don't know who you're dealin' with," one spat, though his bravado rang hollow. The man's rifle didn't waver. "Then ride before I decide it's worth finned-in out." For a heartbeat, the clearing pulsed with tension. The dismounted rustler sneered, then spat into the frost. "Ain't over," he muttered, scrambling back into his saddle. The 3 wheeled their horses and thundered away into the dark, curses trailing like smoke. Silence crept back in, broken only by Abigail's ragged breathing. Her legs gave, and she sank against the rough bark of a pine. The stranger lowered his rifle, dismounted with unhurried grace, and approached. His steps left crisp prints in the frost. "You hurt?" he asked. Abigail shook her head, though her hands trembled as she brushed at her skirts. "No. Just—" her voice cracked. She swallowed. "Just shaken." He reached into his coat, pulled out a canteen, and held it toward her. She hesitated, pride warring with need, then accepted. The water was cool, steadying. She handed it back, eyes flicking over him in quick, wary glances. He was younger than she expected, no more than 30, broad-shouldered and tall, yet something about him felt older, the set of his jaw, the steadiness in his gaze. "I had it handled," she murmured, though they both knew it wasn't true. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Sure you did," she bristled, but his tone carried no mockery, only quiet respect. He crouched beside her, studying the shallow cut on her temple where she'd stumbled earlier. Without asking, he tore a strip from his own kerchief and pressed it gently against the wound. His touch was careful, almost reverent. Abigail flinched, unused to kindness. "I'll manage," she said softly. "You already have." His words were simple, but they lodged deep. The wind shifted, colder now. Dusk bled into night, shadows stretching long. Abigail's mare was gone, her sack of kindling scattered. She glanced toward the darkness where the rustlers had vanished, a shiver running down her spine. "They'll come back," she whispered. The man rose, offered his hand. "Then you best not be here when they do." Her gaze lingered on his hand. Calloused, strong, steady. She hesitated, pride again tugging at her, but the memory of cruel laughter still rang in her ears. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. He pulled her gently to her feet. His horse stood waiting, breath steaming in the chill. He lifted her into the saddle as though she weighed nothing, then swung up behind her, reins in one hand, rifle in the other. The warmth of him at her back startled her, as did the sense of safety that spread despite her fear. They rode in silence, the forest swallowing sound. The moon slid from behind clouds, silvering the frost, catching in the strands of her loosened hair. Abigail sat rigid, every sense sharpened. She wanted to ask his name, his purpose, why he'd helped her. But the words lodged tight in her throat. At last, the trees thinned, and a small cabin came into view, perched on a ridge where the land opened wide. Smoke curled faint from its chimney, lantern light glowing warm against the encroaching night. Relief broke through Abigail's tension. She hadn't realized until then how deeply she longed for warmth. The man dismounted first, steadying her as she slid down. Her knees buckled, and he caught her elbow, holding her upright until she steadied. For a moment, she felt the strength in his grip, the unspoken assurance that he would not let her fall. "Inside," he said simply. The cabin smelled of pine and smoke, of leather and earth. A stove glowed in the corner, casting amber light across rough-hewn walls. Abigail stood uncertain in the doorway, every nerve taut. She had spent so long fending for herself that the sudden gift of safety felt foreign, undeserved. He set his rifle aside, hung his coat, and stoked the stove until flames leapt higher. The warmth pressed against her chilled skin. She lowered herself onto a wooden chair, hands folded tight in her lap, eyes fixed on the fire. At length he spoke. "You'll be safe here tonight." She nodded, still unable to meet his gaze. "I don't want to trouble you." His silence stretched, then softened. "Ain't trouble." Something in his tone made her chest ache. She blinked fast, ashamed of the tears threatening. She was too old for weakness, too worn for longing, too old for love. That thought echoed sharp in her mind, bitter and unyielding. He didn't speak again, only moved with quiet efficiency, pouring water, setting a kettle, arranging kindling. The room filled with small, ordinary sounds that wrapped around her like balm. She felt herself exhale, slowly, as if releasing years of held breath. For the first time in a long while, Abigail allowed herself to lean back in the chair, eyes closing against the warmth. She heard the soft clink of tin mugs, the low sigh of wind at the shutters, the muted creak of floorboards as he moved. Her guard lowered by inches, though she told herself not to let it fall too far. She opened her eyes once more, found him watching her across the room, lantern light catching the sharp lines of his face. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze held no pity, only quiet regard, as though he saw not just her years and weariness but something beyond them. Abigail turned back to the fire, her voice barely more than breath. "I'm too old to be anyone's burden." The silence that followed stretched long, filled only by the pop of resin in the stove. At last, he stepped closer, set a steaming mug on the table beside her. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, yet it carried a weight that made her look up. "Don't reckon you're a burden to me." The words lingered, unexpected, unsettling. Abigail's heart stumbled in her chest. She lifted the mug with shaking hands, warmth seeping into her palms, and for the first time in years, she wondered if perhaps the walls she'd built around herself were not as unbreakable as she believed. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the faint echo of hooves far off in the night. A warning, a reminder. Safety was only temporary. The rustlers would not forget. And though she sat in the glow of firelight, with a stranger who'd risked himself to save her, the shadows beyond the ridge were already stirring. The night thickened outside, a velvet black threaded with the cry of wind. Abigail sat close to the stove, the warmth licking at her cold, stiff fingers, though the tremor within her hadn't yet stilled. The small cabin seemed to breathe with her, walls sighing as the heat expanded them, the chimney murmuring smoke into the starless dark. She could not remember the last time she had been inside a room that felt alive with more than her own weariness. The man, Eli, she learned when he finally gave his name, moved with quiet efficiency. He spoke little, but when he did, his words held weight. He poured steaming water into 2 tin mugs, the hiss of liquid rising like a hymn in the silence. Abigail accepted the drink, wrapping her hands around it as though she could hold the warmth long enough to thaw years of cold. She tried to steady herself, tried not to think of the men whose shadows lingered in her mind, whose laughter still haunted her ears. Eli crouched near the fire, mending a torn glove by lamplight. His concentration was steady, his needle rising and falling in rhythm with the crackling of pine. Abigail watched him through lowered lashes, curious against her will. He was young, 29, he said, but his face bore lines carved by sun, by labor, by solitude. There was a stillness in him that did not belong to youth. She sipped the drink, bitterness of strong coffee cutting through the taste of fear. "You live alone out here?" Her voice was soft, nearly drowned by the fire. He glanced up briefly, then returned to his stitching. "Always have. Always." She tilted her head, salt-streaked hair falling loose from its braid. "No family. Some. Scattered. The land's enough company." His words carried no bitterness, only fact. Abigail lowered her eyes again. She understood the weight of solitude, though hers had been forced, not chosen. She thought of children grown and gone, of a husband buried under hard earth, of neighbors who'd let silence fill the space where comfort might have been. She carried her years like stones in a satchel, each one heavier than the last. She rose after a moment, restless. Her hands, used to endless motion, couldn't stay still. She crossed the small room, gathering stray kindling, stacking it neatly beside the stove. Eli said nothing, only watched her in silence, his needle pausing mid-stitch. She ignored the heat that rose to her cheeks, kept moving. She straightened blankets on his bunk, adjusted the chair that wobbled near the wall. She needed to do something, anything, to keep the trembling from spilling out of her body. "You don't have to," he murmured. Abigail's hands stilled on the blanket. "I can't just sit." He gave a slow nod, as if he understood. The needle resumed its path through leather. The night deepened. Snow began to fall outside, soft against the window, a hush that covered the land. Abigail pulled her shawl tighter, sat again, and drew her feet close to the stove. She let herself watch him now, openly. He was not handsome in the polished way of city men. His beauty was in the quiet strength of him, in the patience of his hands, in the way his presence steadied the air. She wondered if he knew how young he seemed to her, and how impossibly far that youth felt from her own worn reflection. They shared a meal, beans from a pot, cornbread hard at the edges. Abigail ate carefully, as though ashamed of hunger, but Eli pretended not to notice when she reached for a second piece. He only refilled her tin plate, his gaze averted, his silence speaking louder than words. Later, she began to hum. It was a habit she thought long buried, an old hymn her mother used to sing when storms rattled the roof. The tune slipped out before she realized, faint and broken, filling the space between fire and silence. Eli's hands stilled on the bridle he was repairing. He listened, his eyes lowered, as though afraid to frighten the sound away. She faltered, embarrassed, but he spoke at last. "Don't stop." Her throat tightened. "It's an old song. Best kind." His gaze met hers for a breath, then drifted back to his work. Abigail's voice wavered, but she finished the tune. Something unknotted inside her with every note, though it left her chest aching. She turned back to the fire when it was done, unwilling to see what expression lingered on his face. The hours stretched, marked only by the fall of snow and the sigh of wind. At some point, Eli draped a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders without a word. She startled at the gesture, then held it close. She thought she should thank him, but the words stuck. He had already returned to the corner, oiling the barrel of his rifle, movements methodical, steady. She watched him a long while, wondering at the strangeness of safety, how it could feel like a gift she no longer knew how to accept. She dozed eventually, curled near the stove, her shawl and his blanket wrapped tight. When she woke, dawn pressed pale against the frosted glass. The fire had died low, but Eli was already outside, splitting wood, his breath rising in sharp clouds. Abigail rubbed her eyes, bones aching as she rose. She found herself reaching for the broom by his door, sweeping the floorboards until they shone. He entered with an armful of logs, eyebrows raising slightly at the sight. She looked away, embarrassed. "Old habits," she murmured. "Nothing wrong with that." He stacked the logs, his voice even. She wanted to ask him why he lived so far from town, why he hadn't married, why he chose to save her. But each question felt like a stone she wasn't sure she had strength to lift. Instead, she busied herself with the kettle, setting it to boil, pouring the steaming water into mugs as he had done the night before. When he sat across from her at the rough-hewn table, their eyes met briefly. Something flickered there, a glimmer of warmth, of recognition. She looked away quickly, staring into the steam that curled between them. "Eli," she said softly, tasting his name like something forbidden. "Abigail." His reply was steady, anchoring her. Silence stretched, but it was no longer heavy. It was full, almost gentle. Later, she stepped outside into the brittle October air. The snow had dusted the ground, whitening fence posts, softening the rugged land. She drew a breath that burned her lungs and reminded her she was still alive. Eli followed, carrying wood to the shed. She watched the strength of his movements, the steadiness of his frame, and for the first time in years, a thought brushed her, what it might mean to lean, just a little, on someone else's strength. That evening, the wind rose again, whistling through the eaves. Abigail sat near the stove, mending a tear in her shawl. Eli worked at the table, patching tack. At some point, her hands stilled. She noticed the rawness of his knuckles, the redness where cold had split the skin. Without thinking, she rose, crossed to him, and draped the shawl she had just mended over his shoulders. His hands froze mid-stitch. He turned his head slowly, eyes meeting hers. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he gave a small nod, as though acknowledging a truth deeper than words. The silence between them shifted that night. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of something beginning, fragile and uncertain. Still, when the fire burned low, Abigail stared into the embers and whispered to herself, "Too old for love." The words tasted bitter, yet she could not stop them. She did not know Eli heard, his gaze steady in the dim light. He said nothing, only kept his silence. But inside, something firm and unyielding had already settled, waiting for the moment it would finally be spoken aloud. The wind pressed harder against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters like restless hands. Somewhere beyond the ridge, far in the night, the faint echo of hooves drifted on the wind. Abigail stiffened, her needle pausing mid-stitch. The firelight flickered against Eli's face as he lifted his head, eyes narrowing toward the sound. The morning cracked open with brittle sunlight, pale against the snow-dusted earth. Abigail shook the stiffness from her limbs as she stepped outside, her shawl pulled close around her shoulders. The air burned with a clean, sharp chill, each breath a reminder of the season pressing toward winter. She watched Eli splitting logs in a rhythm so steady it might have been part of the landscape itself. An arm rising, the axe biting wood, the clean snap echoing into the valley. Something in her chest tightened as she watched him. She envied his sureness, the way his body seemed born for this land, untroubled by its demands. She, by contrast, felt carved hollow by years of carrying burdens she could not name aloud. Her hands bore the calluses of labor, her hair streaked with gray that had come far too early. Yet as Eli stacked the logs, lifting them with a calm strength, she felt the faintest warmth spark against her doubt, as though simply standing near him might thaw something long frozen. She busied herself with chores, gathering melted snow for water, tidying the cabin as she had done the night before. Eli said nothing, only gave her that steady glance that seemed to weigh and measure without judgment. By midday, the silence between them had grown companionable, interrupted only by the crackle of firewood or the scrape of chair legs on the wooden floor. It was later, as she pegged damp clothes to a rope strung across the cabin wall, that the crack of a rifle rang in the distance. Abigail flinched so hard the clothespin dropped from her fingers. The echo carried through the valley, sharp and menacing. Her heart thudded in her throat, memories rushing unbidden, nights when her husband had staggered home drunk and cruel, mornings when neighbors had turned their faces away from her shame. The sound of gunfire wrapped itself around those memories, binding her chest with fear. "They're closer than they should be," Eli said quietly, setting his cup down. Abigail turned to him, her voice tight. "The men from before?" His eyes were steady. "Most likely." She wanted to protest, to say she'd leave, spare him the danger. But the truth pressed against her ribs. She had nowhere else to go. Her voice broke against her own shame. "I've brought trouble to your door." Eli shook his head once. "Trouble finds its own way. You didn't carry it here." Something in his certainty steadied her, though fear still twisted inside. She lowered herself onto the chair, pressing her hands together as though prayer might yet protect her. She had not prayed in years, not since the day she buried her husband and watched neighbors look away as though her grief were contagious. Faith had slipped through her fingers like sand. Yet here, with the echo of gunfire still lingering, she found herself whispering half-forgotten words under her breath. That evening, with the fire burning low, she spoke pieces of her past aloud. The words spilled like reluctant water, halting and uneven. "I married at 16. Thought it'd be salvation, but it was only another kind of prison. He drank. Spent more nights at the saloon than at home. When he came back, it was with fists or silence. I raised children in the cracks he left behind." Her voice faltered, eyes on the flames. "They're grown now. Scattered. Some right, most don't. I reckon they've buried me in their minds same as their father." She gave a sharp breath, half laugh, half sob. "I don't blame them. What did I ever give them but the shadow of a woman too tired to fight?" The fire popped, casting sparks that drifted like fleeting stars. Eli said nothing, only leaned forward, elbows on knees, his gaze steady on her face. His silence was not emptiness, but a kind of shelter. She had never known what it was to speak without fear of interruption, without the sting of mockery waiting. She felt her throat open, words spilling freer. "I thought maybe, once he was gone, there'd be peace. But the land took everything else. Swindlers claimed the farm. Neighbors closed their doors. I walked away with nothing but what I carried. Folks looked at me like I was too old to start again. And maybe they were right." Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. The shame was raw, still bleeding after all these years. She waited for Eli to turn away, to offer the pity she feared most. Instead, his voice came quiet. "You're stronger than you reckon. Most folks wouldn't have lasted." She met his eyes then, startled by the sincerity etched in them. For a moment, something in her chest uncoiled, though she forced it back down. "Strength don't mean much when it leaves you alone." The words hung heavy. Eli looked into the fire, jaw tightening. After a long pause, he spoke. "I've been alone most my life. Folks said I was too young to know the world, too soft to carry it. Never did take a wife. Never did have much but this land. But I've learned something." He broke off, his gaze shifting to the dark window, snow whispering against the glass. "Some things are worth waiting for." The quiet after that felt charged, as though the air itself held its breath. Abigail lowered her eyes, the weight of his words pressing deep, stirring feelings she dared not name. She busied herself with mending, but her hands trembled so much she could barely guide the needle through cloth. The next day brought a visitor. An old ranch hand, Jedediah Pike, rode up as the afternoon shadows lengthened. His beard was white with frost, his eyes sharp despite the years. Eli greeted him at the door, their voices low but tense. Abigail listened from the stove, her hands clenched around a wooden spoon. "Trouble brewin'," Jedediah muttered. "Rustlers camped down by the creek. Heard 'em speak your name, Eli. Heard 'em speak hers." His gaze flicked to Abigail, heavy with warning. "They aim to finish what they started." Abigail's breath caught. Shame flared again. Her presence had drawn danger to a man who owed her nothing. "I should leave," she whispered. Eli's eyes cut to hers, fierce and unyielding. "You won't." She shook her head. "I won't be the reason you lose everything. You think I'd let you walk into their hands alone?" His voice sharpened, a steel edge she had not heard before. "Not while I'm standin'." The silence that followed trembled with more than fear. Something steadier threaded between them, an unspoken tether that neither had sought but now neither could ignore. Together, they prepared. Eli boarded the shutters, checked rifles, laid out cartridges. Abigail fetched water, stacked wood high by the stove, mended blankets against the cold. She surprised herself with the strength that rose in her, the old resilience not yet dead. Her hands, though lined and weary, carried more than she thought possible. She caught Eli watching her once, admiration plain in his eyes, and it left her breathless. That night, as the snow thickened, Abigail found herself by the stove again, tears slipping without sound. Eli entered from the cold, setting his rifle aside. He froze at the sight of her, then crossed the room slowly, as though afraid to startle her. "I'm too old for dreams," she whispered, voice breaking. Eli crouched beside her, his presence steady as the earth. "Dreams don't check years, Abigail." She lifted her eyes to his, searching for mockery and finding none. The firelight caught the lines of his face, the raw sincerity in his gaze. Her heart clenched, afraid of what it meant, afraid of what she wanted. She looked away quickly, ashamed of the tears she could not stop. It was then the shadow passed across the window. A rider, moving slow, watching. Abigail stiffened, her hand flying to her mouth. Eli rose in an instant, crossing to the rifle propped by the door. The hooves faded into the night, but the message had been clear. The rustlers were close, circling. The sanctuary of the cabin was only borrowed time. Abigail sank deeper into her chair, heart pounding. For all her resilience, for all her insistence that she was too old for love, she knew the truth now. She could not bear to lose this man who had given her a glimpse of something she thought buried forever. And that truth frightened her more than any rider in the dark. The storm came before dawn, rolling down from the high ridges with a fury that bent the trees and drove the snow in wild, blinding swirls. Abigail woke to the howl of wind through the shutters, the cabin trembling against its weight. For a moment, she thought it was the storm alone that had roused her, but then she caught it, the distant thud of hooves, muffled by snow yet unmistakable. Her chest tightened. The rustlers had come. Eli was already awake, seated near the stove, rifle across his knees. He looked up when she stirred, his eyes steady, unreadable. The light from the lantern carved his face in sharp relief, shadow and flame. Abigail drew her shawl tight, though it did little against the deeper chill coiling through her veins. "They're here," she whispered. He gave a single nod. "We knew they would be." Outside, the hooves drew closer, mingled with rough laughter that cut through the storm. Abigail's pulse pounded in her throat. She thought of the knife she had hidden in her apron, the smallness of it against the rifles she heard clattering outside. Still, she slipped it into her hand, needing something to grip. The first shout came through the wind, crude and commanding. "Turn the woman over, McKenna. We ain't a skin twice." Abigail flinched, shame flooding her chest. She moved as if to rise, but Eli's hand caught her wrist, firm and unyielding. His voice was low, fierce. "Don't you dare." Her breath trembled. I won't let you lose everything for me. I'd lose more lettin' you go. His eyes held hers until she dropped her gaze, unable to carry the weight of it. A rifle cracked outside, the bullet striking the cabin wall with a vicious thud. Abigail gasped as splinters rained across the floor. Eli rose, calm despite the danger, and positioned himself by the window, his rifle aimed into the storm. The gunfire that followed was a stuttering roar, bullets smacking into wood, glass shattering. The cabin shuddered under the assault. Abigail moved quickly, reloading cartridges as Eli fired, her hands surprisingly steady. She had not known she could be useful in this way, had not known that fear could sharpen her movements rather than paralyze them. Eli glanced at her once, something like pride flickering in his eyes, before turning back to the fight. Snow swirled outside, thick enough to obscure shapes, but she saw them, dark figures moving low, circling. Eli's shots drove them back, yet they pressed close again, relentless. Smoke from the gunpowder filled the cabin, acrid and choking. Abigail coughed, blinking through tears. Her heart pounded, not only with fear but with the strange, startling clarity of the moment. She wanted to live, not just survive but live. And that realization frightened her most of all. A bullet tore through the shutter, grazing Eli's arm. He staggered back, teeth clenched, blood seeping through his sleeve. Abigail was at his side in an instant, pressing her shawl against the wound. Her hands trembled, but her voice came fierce. "Don't you leave me." His eyes found hers, raw and unguarded. "I've waited my whole life for you. I ain't leavin' now." Her breath caught, the truth of his words crashing through her. She bound the wound as best she could, then pressed the rifle back into his hands. The storm howled, the attackers shouted, and the world shrank to the two of them against the dark. The rustlers pushed harder, voices rising. Abigail heard boots crunching against the snow. Closer, closer. Eli fired again, the muzzle flash lighting his face in brief, searing glimpses. She stood beside him, loading as he shot, handing cartridges with a rhythm that felt almost like prayer. Then came the crash, the door shuddering under a heavy blow, hinges straining. Abigail's pulse leapt. She seized the kitchen knife, holding it close to her chest, the blade catching the firelight. Eli's voice was sharp but calm. "Stay behind me." The door gave way in a splinter of wood. Two men burst inside, snow swirling around them, eyes gleaming with malice. Eli fired, dropping one where he stood. The other lunged, grappling him with wild fury. They crashed against the table, wood splintering, the rifle clattering to the floor. Abigail froze, terror rooting her, until she saw the knife flash in the rustler's hand. Without thinking, she surged forward, driving her blade into his arm. He howled, dropping the weapon. Eli seized the moment, twisting free, striking hard until the man crumpled unconscious at their feet. Abigail gasped, chest heaving, the knife slick in her grip. Eli caught her wrist gently, lowering the blade. His eyes met hers, fierce and tender all at once. "You're stronger than you know." There was no time to answer. More boots crunched outside, shadows swarming through the storm. The cabin shook under their assault. For a heartbeat, it seemed hopeless. Then the storm itself turned. A sudden squall swept down from the ridges, snow thickening into a blinding veil. Horses shrieked in panic, men cursed, shapes scattering in confusion. Eli seized the moment, dragging Abigail to the window. Together they fired into the storm, their shots cracking through the chaos. The rustlers faltered, blinded and broken by the fury of wind and snow. One man remained, the leader, broad and cruel, face twisted with rage. He forced his way inside, eyes locking on Abigail with venom. "You'll pay for this, woman." Eli stepped between them, rifle raised. The leader sneered, swinging his pistol. The shot fired, grazing Eli's side. He staggered, pain etched across his face. Abigail screamed, lunging with the knife, but the leader caught her wrist, twisting hard. She cried out, dropping the blade. Eli roared, hurling himself forward. The two men crashed to the floor, fists and fury flying. Abigail scrambled for the rifle, heart pounding. She lifted it, hand shaking, But before she could fire, Eli seized control, pinning the leader beneath him. Snow swirled through the broken doorway, the storm wailing like some furious spirit. Eli's fist struck once, twice. The leader's strength faltered, his sneer breaking into fear. For a moment, Eli held him there, breath ragged, rage blazing in his eyes. Then, with a shuddering breath, he released him, shoving the man toward the door. "Get out, and don't come back." The leader staggered into the storm, clutching his bruised jaw, curses lost to the wind. The storm swallowed him, and then there was only silence, thick, heavy, broken by the sound of Abigail's trembling breath. The cabin was wrecked, splintered door, smoke thick in the air, blood staining the floorboards. Yet in the wreckage, Abigail felt something bloom in her chest, fierce and unyielding. She turned to Eli, his face pale with pain, blood seeping through his shirt. She pressed her hands to his wound, desperate. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered again, voice breaking. He caught her hand in his, gripping tight despite his weakness. His voice was low, raw. "I told you. I've waited my whole life for you." Tears blurred her vision. She leaned close, pressing her forehead to his. The storm raged around them, but inside, the fire still burned, casting them in its glow. For the first time in years, Abigail felt warmth that had nothing to do with wood or flame. Dawn crept slowly, pale light filtering through the broken shutters. The storm eased, leaving the land buried in white silence. Abigail stepped outside, Eli leaning on her arm, his weight heavy but steady. They stood together on the ridge, breath mingling in the cold. The valley stretched below, blanketed in untouched snow, the world hushed as though holding its breath. Abigail looked at the prints they left side by side in the fresh snow, stark against the white. Something shifted inside her then, breaking free. She turned to Eli, her voice trembling but clear. "Maybe I'm not too old." He gave her a faint, weary smile, his eyes holding hers with unshakable certainty. "Took you long enough to see it." She laughed through her tears, the sound raw and new. Then she kissed him, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that was less about passion than about promise. The snow fell soft around them, the fire behind them still glowing, the world ahead unwritten. And yet, beyond the quiet of the ridge, far down in the valley, a lone rider moved against the white horizon, circling back. The story was not finished. The danger had not ended. Abigail's hand tightened in Eli's, her gaze steady. For the first time, she did not flinch from what waited. She was not alone anymore.